Hello there, and welcome to Wind Down History. I'm glad you found your way here, because tonight we'll be drifting through the life of Queen Elizabeth I. Wherever you are, let this be your moment to slow down. Let the day soften, the edges blur, and your thoughts settle. She was the Virgin Queen who defied an empire and gave her name to a golden age. But while many stories focus heavily on the sinking of the Spanish Armada or the rigid politics of the Privy Council, tonight we will simply follow the path of her life, the details, the decisions, and the world as she saw it. Before we settle in, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Please let me know in the comments below. It is always fascinating to see how far these quiet stories reach. The story begins on a warm afternoon in September 1533 at the Palace of Greenwich. The air in the royal chambers was thick with expectation, heavy with the hope of a nation waiting for a prince. But when the child finally arrived, she was a girl. Her father, King Henry VIII, concealed his disappointment behind a mask of royal duty, cancelling the grand tournaments he had planned. It was the first lesson of Elizabeth's life, learned before she could even speak. Her existence was a complication. For the first 2 years, she lived in the bright, pampered world of a royal heiress. She was the Princess of England, dressed in purple velvet and cradled in the certainty of her mother's love. Anne Boleyn was a woman of sharp wit and dazzling ambition, a figure who filled the nursery with energy and laughter. But in the spring of 1536, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers in the corridors grew urgent and hushed. The king's eye had wandered, and the machinery of the court began to turn against the queen. The end came with brutal speed. On a green in the Tower of London, a swordsman from Calais severed the bond between mother and daughter forever. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, remained in the country, far from the blood and the crowds. She waited for a mother who would never return. The impact on a child of that age is a landscape of confusion, a sudden silence where there was once a voice. The servants looked at her differently now. The title of princess was stripped away, replaced by the stark label of the Lady Elizabeth. She was no longer the heir to a throne, but the daughter of a traitor. Her world shrank to the confines of her nursery and the care of her governess, Lady Bryan. It was here, in the quiet months that followed, that the reality of her new position became clear. Lady Bryan wrote anxious letters to the king's ministers, begging for the necessities of life for the forgotten child. She reported that Elizabeth had outgrown her clothes, that she had no gowns, no bodices, no handkerchiefs. The daughter of the king wore clothes that were threadbare and tight, a physical reminder of her sudden fall from grace. Yet even in the nursery, Elizabeth possessed a startling precocity. Those who watched her noted a gravity beyond her years, a watchful stillness that seemed to guard her thoughts. She learned to read the moods of those around her with the intensity of a scholar studying a complex text. She understood that her safety depended on her ability to be pleasant, to be obedient, and above all, to be invisible. The king eventually remarried, then remarried again. Elizabeth watched the procession of stepmothers with a wary eye. She saw Jane Seymour bring a son, Edward, into the world, finally giving the king the heir he craved. She saw the arrival of Anne of Cleves, and then the young Catherine Howard. Each woman brought a new energy to the court, and each time Elizabeth adjusted her behavior to fit the new dynamic. She became a master of adaptation, molding herself to reflect the desires of whoever held power. But the most terrifying lesson came in 1542 with the fall of Catherine Howard. Elizabeth was 8 years old when her young stepmother was dragged to the block, condemned for the crime of desire. The parallels to her own mother were impossible to ignore. The message inscribed itself upon her young mind. To love recklessly was to invite death. Marriage was not a fairy tale ending. It was a political trap, often fatal for the woman involved. By the time she reached her 10th birthday, Elizabeth had cultivated a protective shell. She was a girl of sharp intellect and rigorous self-control. She devoted herself to her books, finding in Latin and Greek a logic that the treacherous world of the court lacked. She learned to speak only when necessary, to smile without warmth, and to keep her true thoughts locked deep within a fortress of silence. She was a survivor, standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the winds to change. In January 1547, the Colossus fell. Henry VIII died, leaving behind a 9-year-old heir, Edward VI, and a kingdom holding its breath. For 14-year-old Elizabeth, the king's death meant a shift in guardianship. She was placed in the care of her stepmother, the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. Catherine was a woman of warmth and intellect, creating a household that felt, for the first time in Elizabeth's life, like a true home. It was a place of laughter, learning, and safety. But that safety was an illusion, shattered by the arrival of one man, Thomas Seymour. Thomas was the new king's uncle, tall, charismatic, and driven by a hunger for power that far outstripped his political judgment. He quickly, secretly married Catherine Parr, stepping into the role of stepfather to the teenage princess. To the young Elizabeth, starved of male affection and attention, Seymour was a dazzling figure. He was loud, boisterous, and seemingly devoted to her. But his interest soon darkened into something far more complex and perilous. The boundaries of the household began to erode. Seymour would burst into Elizabeth's bedchamber in the early morning, still clad in his nightshirt, engaging in rough physical horseplay that left the young girl flustered and confused. He would tickle her, tease her, and on one occasion in the garden he slashed her black gown into 100 pieces while Catherine Parr held her. It was a bizarre, suffocating atmosphere where the lines between parental affection and predatory desire were deliberately blurred. Elizabeth, navigating the treacherous waters of adolescence, found herself trapped in a game she did not fully understand but could not escape. For a time, Catherine Parr dismissed the behavior as innocent merriment, perhaps blinded by her love for her new husband. But the denial could not hold. In the spring of 1548, the Queen Dowager walked into a room to find her husband holding the princess in an embrace that was undeniably intimate. The illusion of safety collapsed. To protect the girl, and perhaps her own broken heart, Catherine sent Elizabeth away from the household in May. It was a dismissal that stung with the weight of rejection. Elizabeth had lost another mother figure, not to the axe, but to the poisonous ambition of a man. Fate, however, had a cruel twist remaining. In September, Catherine Parr died in childbirth. Thomas Seymour was now a widower, and his ambition, unmoored from his wife's stabilizing influence, turned entirely toward the throne. He set his sights on marrying Elizabeth, a union that would place him within touching distance of the crown. The Privy Council, watching from the shadows, struck hard. In January 1549, Seymour was arrested for treason. But the danger for Elizabeth was just beginning. If she were proven to be complicit in his plots, if she had agreed to marry him without the council's consent, she too could be branded a traitor. Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, a grim and relentless interrogator, was sent to break her. He arrived at her residence expecting to easily intimidate a 15-year-old girl. He separated her from her loyal servants, Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry, and subjected her to weeks of questioning. He pressured her, threatened her, and tried to trick her into a confession. But in the face of this onslaught, the teenage Elizabeth revealed the steel spine of a monarch. She did not weep, and she did not crumble. She met Tyrwhitt's questions with a wall of carefully constructed answers. She admitted only what was already known and denied everything that could incriminate her. When Tyrwhitt told her that her servants had confessed, hoping to panic her, she simply demanded proof. She wrote letters to the Lord Protector that were masterpieces of dignified outrage, defending her honour and demanding that the rumours against her be silenced. Tyrwhitt eventually conceded defeat, writing to his superiors that she had a very good wit, and nothing is gotten of her but by great policy. He could not break her because she had already learned the most vital lesson of the Tudor court: trust no one and give nothing away. On March 20th, 1549, Thomas Seymour was beheaded on Tower Hill. The man who had charmed, confused, and nearly destroyed her was gone. When the news reached her, Elizabeth reportedly showed no emotion, offering only a cold, terrifyingly mature epitaph. This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment. The scandal changed her. The romantic, impressionable girl was buried alongside Seymour. In her place stood a young woman who understood that in the Game of Thrones, passion was a liability, and a mask of cold virtue was the only shield that could not be pierced. The turn of the wheel came on a misty morning in November 1558. Queen Mary I, broken by illness and sorrow, breathed her last, and the crown passed to the survivor. Tradition says Elizabeth was sitting beneath an old oak tree at Hatfield House, reading a book in the crisp autumn air, when the messengers arrived. They fell to their knees, presenting the royal ring as proof of her sister's death. Elizabeth, now 25 years old, looked down at the gold band and quoted the Psalms. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." The long winter of fear was over. The journey from Hatfield to London was a triumphal procession, a river of colour flowing toward the capital. The people lined the roads, hungry for a symbol of hope after years of religious persecution and economic gloom. Elizabeth fed that hunger. She possessed a natural genius for the theatre of monarchy. She smiled at the crowds, accepted their modest gifts of flowers and rosemary, and paused to listen to the speeches of common citizens. She was building a bond of affection that would serve as her greatest fortification. On January 15th, 1559, she was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The air inside the ancient stone cathedral was thick with incense and the weight of history. As the heavy crown was placed upon her head, the noise of the trumpets and the organs swelled, shaking the dust from the rafters. But amidst the pageantry, a quiet, steely calculation was already taking place behind the young queen's eyes. She knew that a crown alone did not grant power. It only granted the opportunity to seize it. Her first and most critical decision had already been made days before the coronation. In the quiet of a private chamber, she summoned William Cecil. He was a man of 40, a lawyer with ink-stained fingers and a mind like a relentless clock. He was not a flashy courtier or a swaggering soldier. He was a bureaucrat of supreme competence. Elizabeth saw in him the one thing she valued above all else: absolute loyalty tempered by brutal honesty. She appointed him her principal secretary, delivering a charge that remains one of the most poignant definitions of service in English history. "This judgment I have of you, that you will not be corrupted with any manner of gift, and that you will be faithful to the state, and that without respect of my private will you will give me that counsel that you think best." It was a profound partnership. He became her spirit, the grounding earth to her mercurial fire. While Elizabeth charmed ambassadors and danced in the galleries, Cecil worked in the shadows, managing the endless flow of paper that kept the kingdom breathing. They would argue, often fiercely, but their minds were perfectly aligned in their devotion to England's stability. Yet the rest of the council presented a challenge. She sat at the head of a table, surrounded by men who had known her since she was a child, men who believed, with the rigid certainty of their age, that a woman was intellectually and emotionally incapable of rule. They expected her to be a figurehead, a placeholder until she could be married off to a foreign prince who would do the actual work of governing. Elizabeth dismantled these expectations with a terrifying grace. She did not shout, and she did not throw tantrums. Instead, she used her education as a weapon. When foreign ambassadors tried to lecture her, she replied in rapid, flawless Latin, leaving them stuttering. When her counselors pressed her for a decision she was not ready to make, she answered with answers, answerless. Long, elegant speeches that sounded profound but committed her to nothing. She mastered the art of the royal delay. In a world where swift action often led to disaster, Elizabeth turned hesitation into a policy. She kept her counselors off balance, playing them against one another, ensuring that she remained the sole arbiter of the final decision. She controlled the room not by demanding silence, but by lowering her voice until they were forced to lean in, desperate to catch every syllable. The young woman who had once trembled while waiting for the axe was gone. In her place sat a monarch who understood that her gender was not a weakness, but a unique instrument of statecraft. She was the mother of the nation, the object of courtly love, and the prince of the realm, all woven into one. As the first year of her reign drew to a close, the men around the table realized they were not guiding a naive girl. They were serving a queen who intended to rule. If William Cecil was the mind of the new regime, the heart belonged entirely to one man, Robert Dudley. While the council meetings were filled with grey beards and serious talk of coin and theology, the court's private hours were dominated by this tall, dark-eyed nobleman who moved with the easy grace of a natural athlete. He was the master of the horse, a position that required him to be physically close to the Queen during every hunt and procession. But their connection ran far deeper than official duty. They were of an age born only months apart, and shared a history written in the shadows of the Tower of London. Both had been prisoners during Mary's reign, their lives hanging by a thread. This shared trauma created a bond that no foreign prince or aged counsellor could hope to penetrate. To Elizabeth, he was her sweet Robin, her eyes. He was the only person in the suffocating grandeur of the court with whom she could simply be a woman rather than a monarch. The court watched, scandalized and fascinated. Ambassadors scribbled furiously in their dispatches, reporting that the Queen spent her days hunting with Lord Robert and her evenings dancing with him. The whispers grew louder. They were lovers. they were secretly married. She was carrying his child. The intimacy was undeniable. Elizabeth, usually so guarded, would openly touch his hand or whisper in his ear, her laughter ringing out across the great halls. For a woman who had spent a lifetime hiding her emotions, Dudley was a dangerous indulgence, a crack in the armour. But there was an obstacle, immovable and inconvenient. Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived far from the glamour of London, residing in the quiet countryside. She was rumoured to be ill, suffering from a malady in her breast, but her existence stood as a wall between the favourite and the throne. As long as Amy lived, Dudley could only be a favourite, never a king. Then, on a Sunday in September 1560, the unthinkable happened. At Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire, while the servants were away at a fair, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a short flight of stairs. Her neck was broken. The news hit the court like a thunderclap. The timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient. The whispers turned into a roar of accusation. Had Dudley ordered it? Had the Queen condoned it? The scandal threatened to engulf the young reign before it had truly begun. In the eyes of Europe, Elizabeth was no longer just a Protestant heretic. She was potentially an accomplice to murder. Elizabeth faced the most agonizing choice of her private life. Her heart pulled her toward Dudley, toward the comfort, the passion, and the familiarity he offered. But her survival instinct, honed in the terrifying years of her youth, screamed a warning. To marry a man under such a cloud of suspicion would be to pawn her crown for her heart. It would confirm every slanderous rumour and alienate the very people she relied on to rule. She made her decision with the cold precision that would come to define her. She ordered an impartial inquest into Amy's death, distancing herself publicly from the man she loved. When the verdict returned as accidental death, it legally cleared Dudley's name, but the stain of suspicion remained indelible in the public imagination. Elizabeth pulled back from the brink. She kept Dudley close, showering him with titles and lands, eventually creating him Earl of Leicester. She kept him in her orbit, spinning him along with promises and affection. But the door to marriage was firmly, quietly closed. She would never let him go, but she would never fully let him in. It was a sacrifice of personal happiness on the altar of political survival, a pattern she would repeat until the end of her days. She had chosen to be the Queen of England first, and a woman second. The year was 1562, and the Queen was 29 years old. She was in the prime of her life, celebrated by poets for her red gold hair and her pale, flawless skin. But in October, while staying at Hampton Court Palace, a shadow fell over the royal household that no army or spy could defend against. It began with a fever, a sudden violent heat that stripped the Queen of her senses. The physicians were summoned, their faces grave as they examined the monarch. The diagnosis was the one word every person in the 16th century dreaded hearing: smallpox. It was a disease that killed without mercy, and for those it spared, it often left behind a landscape of ruin upon the face. As the fever climbed, Elizabeth slipped into unconsciousness. For days, she lay suspended between life and death. The silence in the sick room was heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of her breathing. Outside the heavy oak doors, the panic was absolute. The Privy Council gathered in frantic, hushed meetings. If she died, there was no heir, no husband, and no clear successor. The spectre of civil war, which had torn the country apart only decades before, rose up once again. The men who ruled England were forced to confront the terrifying fragility of their regime. It all rested on the beating heart of one young woman. Deep in her delirium, Elizabeth reportedly cried out for Robert Dudley, begging the council to make him protector of the realm if she should pass. Even at death's door, her thoughts were anchored to him. But she did not die. The fever broke, the mind cleared, and the Queen returned to the world of the living. But the woman who rose from that bed was not the same woman who had fallen into it. The disease had taken its toll. Her skin, once the subject of sonnets, was now pitted and scarred. For a woman whose power relied heavily on her image as a divine, almost supernatural beauty, this was a devastation. In a court where appearance was currency, a queen could not afford to look mortal. This moment marked the beginning of the great construction, the creation of the Mask of Youth. Elizabeth refused to let the world see her scars. She turned to the cosmetic chemistry of the age, specifically a mixture known as Venetian ceruse. It was a thick, white paste made of vinegar and lead. When applied, it created a smooth, porcelain-like canvas that hid every blemish, every pockmark, and every sign of aging. She applied it thickly, painting a face of unchanging perfection over the reality of flesh and blood. To complete the illusion, she began to wear elaborate wigs to cover the thinning of her hair, another side effect of the illness or the stress. She was constructing an icon, a living statue that would remain frozen in time even as the years marched on. But the cost of this perfection was high. The lead in the makeup was a slow poison, seeping into the skin, greying the complexion beneath, and likely causing the headaches and irritability that would plague her later years. It was a cruel irony. The very thing she used to preserve her beauty was slowly destroying her health. Yet Elizabeth accepted the price. She understood that her subjects did not need a human woman. They needed a goddess who was impervious to sickness and time. From the ashes of the fever, the Virgin Queen, the ageless, white-faced icon of history, was born. While Elizabeth was carefully constructing her mask of invulnerability, painting her face white to hide the scars of survival, another queen, north of the border, was living in vivid, chaotic colour. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was everything Elizabeth was not, and everything she perhaps feared. Mary was younger, she was Catholic, and she was widely considered to be a romantic beauty of the highest order. But the most dangerous difference lay in their temperaments. If Elizabeth was ice, watchful, hesitant, and endlessly calculating, Mary was fire. For years, the two women circled each other like celestial bodies trapped in the same orbit, bound by blood and a rivalry that would define the age. They were cousins, both granddaughters of Henry VII, and they referred to one another in their letters as sister. Yet, in a twist of history that feels almost literary, they never met face to face. Their relationship was conducted entirely through ink and paper, a psychological chess match played across hundreds of miles of rain-swept countryside. Elizabeth watched Mary's reign in Scotland with a mixture of fascination and horror. She saw in Mary a cautionary tale, a living demonstration of what happened when a queen allowed her heart to rule her head. Mary governed with her emotions. She sought to live fully as a woman, impulsive and passionate, believing that her divine right to rule would protect her from the consequences of her private choices. The contrast became glaringly fatal in the matter of marriage. While Elizabeth had agonizingly turned away from Robert Dudley to preserve her crown, Mary threw caution to the wind. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a tall, handsome man who proved to be a drunkard, a fool, and a liability. When that union collapsed in murder and scandal, she married James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, the very man accused of killing her husband. It was a reckless, breathtaking collapse of political judgment. Elizabeth wrote to her cousin with a candour that was rare for her, offering advice that sounded less like a rival and more like a desperate older sister. How could a worse choice be made for your honour than in such haste to marry such a subject, who, besides other and notorious shames, public fame has charged with the murder of your late husband? It was a plea for sanity, but it went unheeded. The Scottish lords rebelled, and Mary was forced to abdicate. In 1568, fleeing her own kingdom, she made a decision that would haunt Elizabeth for the next 19 years. She crossed the Solway Firth and landed in England, expecting her sister to restore her to her throne. Elizabeth was now trapped in a nightmare. She could not restore Mary by force, as it would mean warring with the Protestant lords of Scotland. She could not let Mary go to France, where she would become a powerful pawn against England. And she could not simply welcome her to court, for Mary was a Catholic figurehead who claimed the English throne for herself. So Elizabeth chose the only option that delayed the inevitable: the golden cage. She placed Mary under house arrest, moving her between various castles in the Midlands: Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield. It was a comfortable imprisonment, attended by servants and cushioned by luxury, but it was imprisonment nonetheless. For nearly 2 decades, Mary remained the guest of the English state. She became the invisible centre of gravity for every Catholic plot and conspiracy in the kingdom. Yet, through it all, Elizabeth refused to take the final step. Her counsellors, led by the pragmatic Cecil, urged her to execute Mary, citing the safety of the realm. But Elizabeth resisted. To execute an anointed queen was to strike at the very concept of monarchy itself. It was a taboo she could not bring herself to break. Instead, she maintained the fiction of their sisterhood. She sent gifts. She sent physicians when Mary was ill. She wrote letters filled with elaborate affection. But she kept the keys turned. It was a masterclass in the royal delay, keeping a dangerous problem in suspended animation, hoping that time or nature would solve what she could not bring herself to finish. By the late 1570s, the Queen was entering her mid-40s. In the brutal arithmetic of the 16th century, she was an old woman. The radiant girl who had ascended the throne was gone, replaced by a seasoned monarch who had survived smallpox, rebellions, and the suffocating weight of the crown. The question of an heir had largely faded from a panic to a resigned silence. Most of Europe assumed the English Jezebel would die childless. But Elizabeth had one final masterful performance left to give in the theatre of courtship. The stage was set for the arrival of Francis, Duke of Alençon, the younger brother of the King of France. He was 23 years her junior, a man described by contemporaries as small, pockmarked, and possessing a nose that was unfortunately large. He was hardly the fairy tale prince of her youth. Yet Elizabeth, the supreme pragmatist, saw in him a vital shield against the growing power of Spain. Thus began the strangest romance of her reign. She did not treat him with the distant politeness of a diplomat. She welcomed him with the giggling enthusiasm of a schoolgirl. she bestowed upon him a nickname that was both affectionate and disarming. She called him her frog. The court watched in bewilderment as their aging queen played the coquette. She danced with him, whispered in corners with him, and allowed him into her private apartments in her nightgown. It was a spectacle that horrified her Puritan counsellors, who saw only a Catholic foreigner threatening the sanctity of the English throne. But they were missing the game. Elizabeth was using the spectacle of intimacy to weave a diplomatic fortress. As long as France believed a marriage was imminent, they would not attack England, and they would not ally with Spain. The frog courtship dragged on for years, a testament to Elizabeth's genius for procrastination. She wrote him letters of passionate devotion, declaring that she would rather spend a month in purgatory than a day without him. She accepted his gifts and wore his tokens. In November 1581, she famously walked into the gallery at Whitehall, kissed him on the lips before the French ambassador, and gave him a ring from her own hand, declaring to the room that they were betrothed. The news sent shockwaves through London. The bells did not ring. The city sullenly refused to celebrate. Her own household wept, fearing the loss of their Protestant queen to a French Catholic. But the next morning, the sun rose on a different reality. Elizabeth summoned the Duke, and with tears in her eyes told him that the council would not support the match, that the people would not accept it, and that she could not marry him if it meant tearing her country apart. She had bought the alliance with a promise she never intended to keep. When the Duke finally left England in 1582, dejected and unmarried, Elizabeth retreated to her chambers. She penned a poem on Monsieur's departure, which remains one of the few windows into her private soul. In it she wrote, "I am and not, I freeze, and yet am burned, since from myself another self I turned." It was a rare moment of vulnerability. The game was won. England was safe. But as the ships carried her frog back to France, the heavy oak doors of the royal heart slammed shut for the final time. She was now, and would remain, the Virgin Queen, married only to her people, alone in a room crowded with courtiers. By the mid-1580s, the sunlit days of courtly romance were fading into a twilight of paranoia. England felt less like a golden realm and more like a fortress under siege. The Pope had declared Elizabeth a heretic, effectively placing a bounty on her head. Assassins moved through the ports disguised as merchants or priests, carrying with them the blessing of Rome and the intent to kill. In this atmosphere of invisible danger, the defence of the Queen fell to a man who lived entirely in the shadows, Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham was the dark mirror to the bright courtiers who danced in the Queen's presence. Dressed perpetually in sombre black, he was a man of puritanical zeal and terrifying competence. He did not seek the Queen's love. He sought only her survival. To ensure it, he constructed the first modern intelligence state. He had eyes in every harbour, ears in every tavern, and agents embedded in the courts of foreign kings. He read the private mail of ambassadors and turned loyal servants into double agents. But his gaze was fixed most intently on one location: Chartley Castle, the damp, secluded manor where Mary Queen of Scots was now held. For nearly 20 years, Mary had been the passive figurehead of Catholic hope. Walsingham knew that as long as she lived, the plots would continue. He needed more than suspicion to end the threat. He needed proof. He needed Mary to condemn herself. So the spy master set a trap of exquisite cruelty. He knew Mary was desperate to communicate with her supporters, starved of news and hope. He provided her with a secret channel, a way to smuggle letters in and out of the castle hidden inside the watertight bung of a beer barrel. Mary believed she had outsmarted her jailers. In reality, the brewer was on Walsingham's payroll. Every letter she wrote and every letter she received was intercepted, deciphered, copied, and then sent on its way. Walsingham sat in London, reading her most private thoughts before the ink was barely dry. Into this web walked Anthony Babington. He was young, wealthy, and foolishly romantic, a Catholic gentleman who saw Mary not as a dangerous political rival, but as a damsel in distress. He gathered a group of like-minded young men, and together they hatched a plot that was as ambitious as it was naive. They would invade England, liberate Mary from her prison, and assassinate Elizabeth. Babington wrote to Mary in July 1586, outlining the plan in explicit detail. He spoke of the dispatch of the usurper, a polite euphemism for the murder of the Queen. Then he waited. In London, Walsingham also waited. He had the letter, but it was not enough. He needed Mary to agree to it. He needed her handwriting on a death warrant for her cousin. On July the 17th, Mary replied. Driven by years of confinement and the intoxicating prospect of freedom, she made the fatal error. She did not reject the plan. She endorsed it. She asked for details on how the 6 gentlemen would accomplish their task. Walsingham had his proof. But he added one final chilling flourish. His codebreaker, Thomas Philippes, forged a postscript to Mary's letter, asking Babington for the names of the assassins. When Babington replied with the list, the net closed. The conspirators were rounded up, and the path to the block was cleared. For Elizabeth, the revelation was a personal heartbreak. She had protected Mary for decades, resisting the calls for her blood. Now she was confronted with undeniable evidence that her sister had sanctioned her murder. The betrayal cut through the diplomatic fiction they had maintained for so long. The trial was a formality. The verdict was inevitable. But even then, Elizabeth hesitated. For months, the death warrant sat on her desk, unsigned. She railed against her counsellors, weeping and pacing, trapped between the necessity of her safety and the horror of killing an anointed queen. It was a decision that would weigh heavily on her for the rest of her years. Finally, in February 1587, she signed the paper, though she would later claim she never meant for it to be sent. But the machinery of the state, driven by Cecil and Walsingham, did not wait for her to change her mind. On a cold morning at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded. The rival was gone, but the shadows in the corridors seemed only to lengthen. The death of a Catholic queen was not an end, but a beginning, a declaration of war that would bring the wrath of Spain to England's shores. The consequences of Mary's execution arrived on the horizon in July 1588. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, launched the Great Enterprise, a massive fleet intended to crush the heretic queen and restore England to the Catholic fold. The Spanish Armada was a floating city of wood and cannon, a force so overwhelming that defeat seemed not just possible, but probable. England waited for the invasion with a collective breath held in terror. Beacons primed on every hilltop to signal the end of the world they knew. But the actual clash at sea was brief and chaotic. The English fleet, nimble and desperate, sent burning ships drifting into the Spanish formation at Calais, breaking their heavy crescent line in a panic of fire and smoke. The scattered galleons were then driven north by a relentless gale, the Protestant wind smashing them against the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland until the invasion force was reduced to driftwood. The greatest military threat of the age was dismantled not by a grand final battle, but by weather, luck, and the desperation of the sea. While the ships were still skirmishing in the Channel, however, the fear on land was absolute. The English army gathered at Tilbury in Essex, a ragtag force waiting for the Spanish soldiers to land. They were ill-equipped and anxious, staring out at the grey water, expecting at any moment to see the veteran tercios of Spain wading ashore. It was into this atmosphere of dread that Elizabeth chose to ride. Her counsellors had begged her to stay away. They warned her that placing herself among armed multitudes was madness, that an assassin's dagger could easily find her in the confusion of the camp. The fear of treachery was high. The Queen was advised to remain safe behind the thick walls of St. James's Palace. But Elizabeth understood the theatre of leadership better than any man in her kingdom. She knew that a queen who hid in the shadows could not command the loyalty of men about to die. She arrived at Tilbury on a white gelding, a striking figure against the drab assembly of soldiers. She wore a dress of white velvet, but over it she donned a silver breastplate, a visual contradiction that perfectly captured her dual nature. She was the Virgin Queen, the mother of the nation, yet also the warrior prince, ready to defend it. She rode through the lines, not with a heavy guard, but with an openness that bordered on recklessness. She wanted them to see her, and more importantly, she wanted to see them. When she stopped to speak, she delivered a performance that would be etched into the national soul. She did not speak of strategy or logistics. She spoke to their hearts, turning her gender, the very thing her enemies used to mock her, into her greatest weapon. Her voice, usually so controlled, rang out with a clarity that silenced the wind. My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. She rejected the safety her advisers offered. She placed her life in the hands of the common soldier. And then came the lines that transformed her from a politician into a legend. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. The effect was electric. She framed the invasion not as a religious war, but as a personal insult to her and her people. She stood before them, not as a distant monarch, but as a fellow soldier, promising to take up arms herself if the Spaniards dared to set foot on English soil. I myself will be your general judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. It was a masterstroke of emotional alchemy. She took the fear of the army and transmuted it into a fierce, protective love. The soldiers who had been terrified of the Spanish now cheered for their queen. She had given them something more powerful than cannons. She had given them a cause worth dying for. Though the Spanish army never landed, the image of Elizabeth at Tilbury became the defining portrait of her reign. The scarred survivor, the hesitant politician, and the painted icon all vanished. In their place stood Gloriana, the invincible empress, the woman who had stared down the might of an empire and refused to blink. The bells of London were still ringing. The bonfires lit to celebrate the defeat of the Armada had barely turned to ash. The air was thick with a triumphant energy. England had survived, the Spanish giant had been humbled, and Elizabeth stood at the absolute zenith of her glory. She was the saviour of the realm, the goddess of war, the untouchable Gloriana. But history has a cruel sense of timing. Just as the public noise of victory reached its crescendo, a devastating silence was descending upon the Queen's private heart. In the midst of the celebrations, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was quietly fading. The years had not been kind to him. He had grown heavy, his face flushed, his health broken by the relentless stress of service and the malaria he had contracted years before. He had stood beside her at Tilbury, holding the bridle of her horse, the faithful steward of her safety. But the effort had exhausted the last reserves of his strength. He asked for permission to leave the court, to travel to the healing waters of Buxton in Derbyshire, hoping for a cure, or at least a respite. The farewell between them was poignant. They had known each other since they were children of 8 years old. They had shared the terror of the Tower, the heady days of their youth, the scandals, the arguments, and a love that had shifted shape 1,000 times, but never broken. As he rode away from the palace, Elizabeth likely watched him go with the sinking familiarity of a goodbye that felt final. On his journey north, Dudley stopped at a house in Oxfordshire. From there, he wrote her a letter. It was dated August 29th, 1588. In it, he inquired after her health, "the chiefest thing in this world I pray for." He signed it with the nickname she had given him 30 years before. "Your Majesty's most faithful and obedient servant, R. Leicester." 6 days later, on September 4th, he was dead. The news travelled slowly back to the capital, carried by messengers who must have dreaded delivering the blow. When it finally reached Elizabeth, the effect was cataclysmic. This was not the death of a minister or a general. This was the amputation of a part of her own soul. For 3 decades, he had been the fixed point in her turning world. He was the only man who dared to tell her the truth, the only man she had ever seriously considered marrying, and the only human being who remembered the girl she was before the crown consumed her. In her grief, the discipline that had held her together for a lifetime simply collapsed. She retreated into her private chambers and locked the door. She refused to see her counsellors. She refused to eat. She refused to sign the papers of state. The court, usually a hive of orchestrated movement, ground to a halt. For days, the most powerful woman in the world was just a grieving survivor, hiding in the dark. The situation became so desperate that William Cecil, her oldest advisor, eventually had to order the door to be broken down. It was a violation of protocol that would have been unthinkable at any other time. But the business of the kingdom could not stop for a broken heart. Elizabeth was forced to emerge, to wipe her face, and to resume the performance of monarchy. But she kept a piece of the grief for herself, hidden away where the state could not touch it. Years later, after her own death, a small wooden casket was found by her bedside. Inside, among her most precious possessions, was the letter Dudley had written to her just days before he died. On the outside, in her own handwriting, she had written a simple, heartbreaking label: his last letter. The victory over Spain had secured her throne, but the death of Dudley emptied it of its personal joy. The sweet Robin was gone. The spirit Cecil was old and ailing. The generation that had raised her and protected her was vanishing. Elizabeth was now truly alone on the summit, a solitary figure surrounded by a new generation of ambitious young men who saw her not as a woman to be loved, but as an old queen to be managed. The mask of youth would now have to be worn not just for vanity, but for armour. Into the vacuum left by Leicester's death stepped a figure of dazzling, dangerous promise. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was everything the grieving queen needed to distract her from the silence of her empty chambers. He was young, scarcely 20 years old when he first captured her attention, and possessed a reckless vitality that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He was tall, athletic, and blessed with the kind of arrogant beauty that demands to be looked at. He was also, by a twist of fate, the stepson of the late Robert Dudley. For Elizabeth, looking at Essex was like looking at a ghost of her own past, a younger, wilder echo of the man she had loved for 30 years. But where Dudley had been a steady anchor, Essex was a firework, bright, loud, and prone to exploding without warning. The dynamic that developed between the aging queen and the young earl was a complex theatre of illusion. Elizabeth was now in her late 50s. The mask of white lead and red wigs was no longer just a cosmetic choice. It was a necessity of state. She was fighting a war against time, and in Essex she found a way to turn back the clock. When she was with him, the heavy atmosphere of the court lifted. They would talk for hours, dance, and play cards until the early light of dawn bled through the palace windows. He treated her not as a reverent grandmother, but as a desirable woman, feeding the fantasy that she was still the ageless Gloriana. For his part, Essex played the role of the devoted knight with a frantic intensity. He wrote her letters filled with extravagant praise, complaining of the misery of being away from her divine presence. He wore her favour on his sleeve and tilted at tournaments in her honour. But beneath the poetry lay a naked, grasping ambition. Essex did not just want to be the Queen's favourite. He wanted to be her master. He belonged to a new generation of men who had not known the terrified young Elizabeth of the Marian years. They saw only an old woman who hesitated too much, a relic who needed to be guided by the strong hand of a martial hero. Essex believed with the supreme confidence of youth that he was that hero. He viewed the caution of the older councillors, like the Cecils, as cowardice. He hungered for war, for glory, and for a world where his sword could cut through the tangled knots of diplomacy. The court watched this dangerous dance with bated breath. It was a relationship defined by volatility. They fought with the passion of lovers and the viciousness of enemies. Essex would insult her, turning his back on her in a fit of petulance, a breach of protocol that would have sent other men to the Tower. Elizabeth, in turn, would berate him, banish him from her presence, and then, inevitably, forgive him. She indulged him in a way she had never indulged Dudley. She paid his massive debts. She granted him the monopoly on sweet wines, a lucrative source of income. She gave him command of armies. It was as if she were trying to buy his affection, or perhaps trying to buy the sensation of youth that he provided. She knew with her sharp cynicism that his flattery was transactional. She once remarked to a visiting ambassador, "When he is away, we are all as dead." It was an admission of how much she had come to rely on his energy to keep the shadows at bay. But the indulgence had a limit, and the cracks in the foundation began to show. Essex began to mistake her patience for weakness. He forgot that the woman underneath the wig and the paint was the same woman who had outmaneuvered the most powerful princes in Europe. He began to believe his own legend, thinking that the applause of the crowd and the favour of the Queen were the same thing as power. He was wrong. He was dancing on the edge of a precipice, blinded by his own reflection, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crumble. The final rupture began, not with a shout, but with a frantic, muddy ride. In 1599, Essex had been sent to Ireland to crush a rebellion led by the Earl of Tyrone. It was his chance to prove himself the great warrior he claimed to be. Instead, he floundered. He wasted time, wasted money, and eventually signed a humiliating truce. Realizing that his enemies back in London, the Fox, Robert Cecil, were likely turning the Queen against him, Essex made a decision born of panic. He abandoned his post, defying the Queen's direct orders, and raced back to England to throw himself at her feet. He rode for days, hardly sleeping, driven by the desperate belief that if he could just see Elizabeth, he could charm her as he always had. He arrived at Nonsuch Palace at 10 o'clock in the morning on September 28th. He did not stop to change his boots or wash the travel dirt from his face. He did not wait to be announced. He burst through the presence chamber, past the startled guards, and pushed open the door to the Queen's private bedchamber. What happened next was a moment of profound psychological violence. For decades, Elizabeth had carefully curated her appearance, ensuring that no man ever saw her until the mask was perfectly in place. But when Essex burst into the room, he found the Queen unready. She had just risen. The famous red wig was sitting on its stand. The layers of white makeup had not yet been applied. Essex stood frozen, staring at a woman he likely scarcely recognized. He saw her grey hair hanging thin and uneven in wisps about her ears. He saw the deep lines etched into her skin, the sunken cheeks, the vulnerability of a 66-year-old woman stripped of her armor. It was the one thing Elizabeth could never forgive. He had seen the truth. He had shattered the illusion that held the court in thrall. In that silent chamber, the mask of youth lay in pieces on the floor. Elizabeth, however, did not scream. She did not cover her face or call for the guards. With a composure that is almost terrifying to contemplate, she allowed him to kneel. She let him kiss her hand. She spoke to him quietly, listening to his rushed, chaotic explanations about Ireland. She was gentle, almost kind, telling him to go and wash himself and rest, and that she would see him later. Essex left the room, believing he had won. He told the courtiers outside that he found the Queen sweet. He thought his charm had worked its magic once again. He did not understand that he had just signed his own political death warrant. When he returned later that afternoon, the scene had changed. The woman who greeted him was no longer the vulnerable grandmother he had surprised in the morning. The wig was pinned high and tight. The white lead paint was thick and flawless. The jewels were heavy around her neck. She sat stiffly, surrounded by her counselors, her eyes cold and hard as flint. The royal delay had ended. She demanded to know why he had abandoned his army. She demanded to know why he had burst into her privacy like a madman. The charm that had worked on the unready woman bounced harmlessly off the armor of the Queen. That night, Essex was ordered to remain in his room. The next day, he was placed under house arrest. The spell was broken. By seeing her without her mask, he had unwittingly forced her to assert her power in the most absolute terms. She had to prove that the grey-haired woman he had seen was an illusion, and that the terrifying, ageless monarch before him was the reality. He had intruded upon the sanctuary of her image, and for that he would pay with everything he had. The fall of Robert Devereux was not a swift drop, but a slow, agonizing suffocation. Stripped of his offices and banned from court, he sat in his grand house on the Strand, watching his influence evaporate. The silence from the palace was deafening. Elizabeth, usually so quick to forgive, remained implacable. She was teaching him a lesson in humility, waiting for genuine contrition. But Essex was incapable of humility. He possessed only pride and a mounting panic. The final blow was financial. His monopoly on sweet wines, the source of his immense wealth, was up for renewal. He wrote to the Queen, begging her to renew it, using language that was pathetic in its desperation. Elizabeth's reply was dry and devastating. An ungovernable beast must be stopped of his provender so that he may be tamed. She cut off his income. It was a calculated move to force him to his knees, but instead it drove him to madness. The sweet robin turned into a wolf. His house became a gathering place for every malcontent in London, disgraced soldiers, Puritan zealots, and desperate men who believed the Queen was losing her mind. The whispers in the dark corners of Essex House grew treasonous. Essex began to speak of his sovereign with a venom that shocked even his friends. He was heard to say that the Queen was an old woman, no less crooked in her mind than in her carcass. It was the insult of a man who knew exactly where to aim the knife. When the words reached Elizabeth, as all words eventually did, they likely hurt more than any political betrayal. She had indulged him, forgiven him, and perhaps even loved him in her own guarded way. Now he was mocking the very physical decay she fought so hard to hide. On Sunday, February 8th, 1601, the tension snapped. Essex launched his rebellion. He burst out of his house with 200 armed men marching toward the city of London, shouting that his life was in danger, crying out for the citizens to rise up and support him. But the loud drama of the coup was pitiably short. The people of London stared at him from their windows in confused silence. No one joined the march. The city gates were barred against him. By evening, the rebellion had dissolved into a farce, and Essex was forced to surrender, trapped in his own home. The trial that followed was swift. The verdict was inevitable: death. But for Elizabeth, the tragedy was just beginning. She was now 67 years old, and she faced the task of signing the death warrant for the man who had been the last bright spark of her life. The struggle over the signature was agonizing. Legend says she signed it, then recalled it, then signed it again. She sat in her chambers, the parchment before her, caught between the Queen who had to punish treason and the woman who remembered the young man who had danced with her until dawn. To kill Essex was to kill the last illusion of her youth. It was an admission that the age of romance was dead, replaced by the cold necessity of survival. On the morning of February 25th, 1601, within the walls of the Tower of London, Robert Devereux met the end he had courted. He asked for a private execution, sparing himself the humiliation of the public crowd on Tower Hill. He died piously, admitting his ambition had been a leprosy. When the news of the axe's fall reached the palace, Elizabeth was reportedly playing the virginals, a small keyboard instrument. She did not stop playing. The music continued, steady and unbroken, filling the silence of the room. But those who knew her well saw the light go out of her eyes. She had survived the plot, but something vital had been severed. The mask of youth remained fixed in place, white and perfect. But the woman behind it began to fade, retreating into a grief that no amount of flattery could ever reach again. The year turned to 1601. The execution of Essex had left a silence in the heart of the court, but outside the palace walls the noise of the world was growing louder. The England that Elizabeth ruled was changing. A new generation had grown up who knew no other monarchs, yet they were restless. The costs of the long wars with Spain and the rebellion in Ireland had drained the treasury. To pay the bills without raising taxes, which Elizabeth hated to do, she had relied on granting monopolies to her courtiers. These were exclusive rights to sell common goods like salt, starch, and vinegar. It was a system that bred corruption. Prices soared and the common people grumbled. When Parliament gathered in November 1601, the mood was ugly. The House of Commons, usually so deferential to their Gloriana, was in open revolt. They refused to vote for new subsidies until the grievance of the monopolies was addressed. It was the sharpest political crisis of her final years, a moment where the love affair between the Queen and her people threatened to turn into a bitter divorce. Elizabeth, now 68 years old and visibly frail, could have reacted with the imperious anger of her father. She could have dissolved Parliament and sent the members to the Tower. But her political genius remained untouched by age. She understood that she could not rule by fear alone. She needed their hearts. She sensed that this was not just a political dispute, but a moment to define how she would be remembered. She sent word that she would address the grievance immediately. She cancelled the most hated monopolies and promised to investigate the others. The tension in the House evaporated instantly, replaced by a wave of relief and gratitude. A delegation of 140 members was invited to Whitehall Palace to thank her. On November 30th, they crowded into the council chamber. The Queen sat under the canopy of state, dressed in her heavy robes, the mask of youth painted perfectly upon her face. But when she spoke, she dropped the royal "we" and spoke to them simply, intimately, as a woman speaking to her oldest friends. What followed became known to history as the Golden Speech. It was not a legal defense or a political manifesto. It was a love letter. It was a masterclass in emotional alchemy, turning a room full of angry politicians into weeping admirers. She began by acknowledging their thanks, but quickly pivoted to the core of her reign, her absolute devotion to them. "I do assure you," she said, her voice steady and clear, "that there is no prince that loves his subjects better, or whose love can obtain no greater excellence than the love that I bear to you." She stripped away the glamour of the crown to reveal the burden underneath, offering a glimpse of the human cost of her power. To be a king and wear a crown is more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasure to them that bear it. It was a line of breathtaking honesty. She was admitting that the jewels and the velvet were heavy, that the throne was a lonely place, and that her joy came not from the power itself, but from the people she wielded it for. She told them that she had never signed a grant that she did not believe was for the good of England, and if she had erred, it was an error of the mind, not the heart. She framed herself not as a tyrant, but as a servant of God and the state, acting only for their preservation. And though you have had, and may have, many princes more mighty and wise sitting in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any that will be more careful and loving. As she finished, the room was silent. Many of the hardened men of Parliament were openly weeping. She had disarmed them completely. She had turned a constitutional crisis into a moment of shared intimacy. She asked them to come forward and kiss her hand before they left, a gesture of physical connection that broke the rigid protocol of the court. One by one, they knelt. They touched the hand of the woman who had been the mother of their nation for 43 years. For many, it was a farewell. Elizabeth likely knew, as she looked out at the sea of faces, that this was her swan song. She had secured her legacy. She would not be remembered as the old woman who taxed their salt, but as the queen who loved them more than she loved herself. She had played the final hand of her reign, and she had won. The winter of 1602 was harsh, and the cold seemed to settle deep within the bones of the queen. She was now 69 years old, a survivor of an age that had already vanished. Her friends were dead. Her enemies were dead. The sweet robin, the frog, the spirit, and the wolf all had gone into the dark before her. She moved through the corridors of Richmond Palace like a ghost in her own life, haunted by the silence where their voices used to be. In January 1603, the court noticed a profound change. The meticulous routine that had governed her life for 44 years began to fracture. She wore the same gown for days. She sat for hours in a low chair, staring at a fixed point on the floor, her finger pressed against her lips in a gesture of deep, inscrutable contemplation. It was as if she were listening to a conversation that no one else could hear. Her godson, Sir John Harrington, tried to cheer her by reading some witty verses he had written. She looked at him with a weary smile and whispered, "When thou dost feel creeping time at thy gate, these fooleries will please thee less." It was a rare admission of the truth she had fought so long to deny. The mask was slipping, and the woman beneath it was tired. By March, the decline accelerated. A jagged swelling appeared in her throat, making it difficult to swallow. She refused to eat. But more terrifying to her physicians, she refused to sleep. She was seized by a conviction that if she lay down in her bed, she would never rise again. So she fought the inevitable with the last of her legendary stamina. She stood. For 15 hours, the Queen of England stood upright, clinging to the heavy hangings of her chamber for support. Her legs, swollen and painful, held her up through sheer force of will. Her ladies wept, begging her to rest, but she would not yield. She was fighting a battle against death itself, standing her ground as she had done against the Armada, refusing to surrender an inch of her sovereignty. Robert Cecil, the son of her old spirit, tried to intervene. He was a practical man, lacking his father's delicate touch. He told her, with a hint of frustration, that she must go to bed for her own safety. The word sparked a final flash of the Tudor fire. Elizabeth turned her eyes upon him, eyes that could still terrify a room, and snapped, "Must is not a word to be used to princes, little man." It was her final rebuke, a last defense of the divine right she embodied. But the body has limits that even a queen cannot command. Eventually, her strength failed. She allowed her servants to lift her, not into the great royal bed, but onto a pile of velvet cushions spread on the floor. There she lay for 4 days, silent and motionless, a small, frail figure lost in a sea of fabric. The question of the succession, the great taboo of her reign, could no longer be avoided. The council gathered around the cushions, their faces grave. They needed a name. They asked if she would accept James VI of Scotland, the son of her old rival Mary. Elizabeth could no longer speak, her throat closed by the illness. But as they named him, she slowly raised her hand and touched her fingers to her head in the shape of a crown. It was done. The long game was over. The House of Tudor would end with her. On the evening of March 23rd, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, knelt beside her. He began to pray, calling on God to grant her life. But Elizabeth, who had clung to life with such ferocity, now signalled for him to change his prayer. She lifted her hand again, gesturing for him to stop asking for recovery and instead to pray for her release. She was ready. The room grew quiet. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the night. The mask of youth, the white lead paint that had hidden her face for decades, had faded. What remained was simply Elizabeth, stripped of the wigs, the jewels, and the politics. She turned her face to the wall and closed her eyes. In the early hours of March 24th, 1603, just as the sky was beginning to grey with the dawn, the breathing stopped. There was no struggle, no final speech. One of her ladies reported that she departed mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from the tree. After 70 years of noise, danger, and glory, the end was absolute silence.